All right, so buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving into a what-if scenario that's, well, let's just say it's pretty intense. What if Germany takes a hard right turn in the 2025 elections?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And we're talking about the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, actually winning the whole thing. We've
Hmm.
been digging into some analysis on this, and trust me, it gets pretty wild. This isn't just some German political shakeup. We could be talking about shockwaves across Europe, even the whole world.
It's fascinating, really, the potential for a domino effect, Like the AfD winning could set off a whole chain reaction of changes. Everything from, well, global alliances and how the world deals with climate change to economic trends. It's all up for grabs.
So let's zero in on Germany first. The analysis points to some pretty drastic potential shifts, especially in three main areas: immigration policy, the stability of their democratic institutions, and just the whole social climate.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to unpack all that?
Well, immigration seems like a good place to start. It's a cornerstone of the AfD's platform. They're really focused on it, calling for a big reduction in immigration. So if they actually get into power, we could see a real tightening of asylum laws, way more deportations, and basically just a much less welcoming environment for people trying to, find refuge or opportunity in Germany.
Sounds like a recipe for social unrest, to be honest. Wouldn't such a drastic shift, I mean, wouldn't that spark protests, legal challenges? The analysis mentions that, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Stricter immigration policies could definitely lead to some widespread social unrest. And I mean, it's not just a theory. We can look at history, sociological studies. It's pretty clear that rapid policy shifts, especially ones that touch on things like immigration and social identity, they can really light a fire under public dissent and even, well, escalate into bigger conflicts.
So beyond the immediate reactions, what about the long-term impact on Germany's democracy? The analysis, it flags some pretty serious concerns about the AfD's influence on democratic processes, right?
Yeah, definitely. What's really striking is that the AfD is, well, they're under surveillance right now.
Really?
Yeah, by Germany's own domestic intelligence agency. They're worried about potential constitutional violations,
Hmm.
And I mean, this isn't just some fringe group. We're talking about a major political party trying to, become the leadership of the country.
Wow. Okay. Being watched by your own country's intelligence agency, that's a big red flag. What are the experts specifically worried about? I mean, what are they afraid the AfD might do if they actually get into power?
The erosion of democratic norms, that's the big one.
Oh.
They're worried about the checks and balances that keep a democracy healthy, that they might be weakened.
Hmm.
Freedom of the press, judicial independence, protection of minority rights, those are all on the line.
That's unsettling to think about. It's not even just policy changes. It's about potentially changing the whole fabric of their democracy. And this isn't happening in isolation, is it? I mean, Germany isn't exactly known for being politically polarized, but, well, this analysis paints a picture of a society that's already pretty divided.
Yeah.
How would an AfD victory play into that, do you think?
Well, the AfD is a very polarizing force, that's for sure. They've been criticized for, using divisive rhetoric, promoting policies that really only appeal to a specific part of the population, often at the expense of marginalized groups. So yeah, if they win, it could definitely make the tensions between conservative and progressive factions in Germany even worse.
So we're not even just talking about policy disagreements at that point. It's deeper, right? Like potential for real social divisions, maybe even within families and communities.
Exactly. It's about how people relate to each other, how they view their country, what they think the future should look like.
Right, right. Okay, so we've got potential social unrest, concerns about democracy being weakened, and a society that's increasingly divided. And we haven't even gotten to the economic side of things yet. The analysis suggests the AfD's economic policies could cause some serious upheaval, not just within Germany, but across the whole European Union. They're, what do you call them, Eurosceptics, right?
That's the term, yeah. They're definitely known for that, being critical of the EU and its policies. Some of them even support, get this, Dexit,
They exit.
short for Germany exiting the EU, like Brexit, but with Germany.
Whoa, okay. That would be, I mean, Dexit would be a massive deal. Germany's the EU's economic powerhouse, isn't it?
Exactly. Biggest economy in the EU, major contributor to the bloc's budget. So even without a full Dexit, even just cutting back their financial contributions or involvement, that would send shockwaves through the whole European economy.
So from social unrest to a potential Dexit, it seems like Germany could be in for a wild ride if the AfD takes charge. But like you said earlier, this isn't just a German story, right? Let's shift gears now and look at the potential ripple effects across the European Union as a whole. Ready to dive into that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think understanding the potential impact on the EU is, well, it's crucial for grasping the whole picture here. This is bigger than just German politics. It's about the future of European integration and, honestly, even the global order.
Okay, so we've laid out how an AFD win could really shake things up inside Germany. But what about the rest of the EU? I mean, how do we even start to untangle that mess?
Well, we can't forget about that Dexit threat we were talking about. Even if it doesn't actually happen, just the possibility of Germany pulling back, that alone could send tremors through the entire EU structure.
Yeah, that Dexit thing is really sticking with me. What are the chances of it actually happening, do you think? And what would it even mean for the EU if it did?
It's tough to say, like, put an exact percentage on Dexit actually happening, but the fact that it's being discussed by a major political party, that shows you how deep this Euroscepticism runs in Germany. Now imagine Germany, the economic heart of the EU, just up and leaving. It'd be a colossal blow. We could be talking financial crisis, the whole project of European integration unraveling, and it would definitely give a boost to other Eurosceptic movements all over Europe.
Wow, that's a pretty bleak picture. But even if they don't fully leave, you mentioned that just cutting back their financial contributions would be a big problem, right? Germany puts a lot of money into the EU pot, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The EU relies heavily on Germany to fund all kinds of things, infrastructure development, scientific research, you name it. If Germany suddenly slashed those contributions, the EU would be in a really tough spot, cut programs, demand more from other countries, or probably a combination of both, and none of those options are very appealing.
It's like, you've got a family and one person just stops contributing financially. Creates all sorts of tension, resentment rates. Yeah, couldn't the same thing happen within the EU?
Definitely. You'd see a surge in resentment from other countries, a lot of whom already think Germany has too much power in the EU anyway. It could lead to a real breakdown in cooperation, less solidarity, and ultimately just weaken the whole bloc.
So we're looking at potential financial strain, rising tensions between countries. But what about the EU's political landscape as a whole? Wouldn't an AFD-led Germany just clash with the more pro-EU countries?
Oh, for sure. The AFD's nationalism, their anti-immigration stance, it goes against the core values of a lot of the pro-EU countries.
Yeah.
Places like France, Spain, the Benelux countries, they see the EU as this project based on shared values, cooperation. So, yeah, you could see constant diplomatic clashes, policies getting stuck, maybe even new alliances forming within the EU. Basically, the whole political landscape could fracture.
Like a political earthquake,
Yeah.
shaking up the EU's tectonic plates or something. And it wouldn't just stay within the EU's borders either, would it? We were talking about how an AFD win might embolden other right-wing populist movements in Europe.
Exactly. Think about Le Pen's national rally in France or Meloni's government in Italy. They share a lot of the AFD's core ideas. So if the AFD succeeds in Germany, it could give those groups a huge boost, make them seem more legitimate, give them more momentum, and that could shift the whole political center of gravity in Europe towards the right.
So instead of the EU moving forward as a unified force, it could actually start to break apart and move towards more nationalistic, inward-looking policies.
Yeah, that's a real possibility. And that inward shift would have a big impact on how the EU deals with global issues, especially climate change.
Right, the EU has been a real leader in pushing for action on climate change. How would a more right-wing, possibly fragmented EU approach that?
Well, the EU has set these ambitious targets for reducing emissions, transitioning to renewable energy. But if Germany starts backtracking on its climate commitments under the AFD, other countries, especially those struggling economically, they might be tempted to do the same. They could argue that they can't shoulder the burden alone, and that would weaken the EU's position in global climate negotiations. Basically, those ambitious goals would become much harder to achieve.
It's like, you have a team and the strongest player suddenly decides they're not giving it their all anymore. It demoralizes everyone else, and they start slacking off too. So we're talking about financial instability, political fragmentation, and a weaker stance on climate change within the EU. But this analysis goes even further, right? It suggests that an AFD victory could have ripple effects way beyond Europe, even impacting the global balance of power.
Absolutely. Germany is a major player on the world stage. They have a lot of influence. So an AFD government with this nationalist, protectionist agenda, it could really change how Germany approaches foreign policy. And that would affect their relationships with key partners like the US, Russia, China.
Okay, so we're going from German domestic politics to global power dynamics now. Let's break that down a bit. Where do we start? Maybe with the U.S., that's a pretty crucial relationship for Germany and for Europe as a whole, right?
For sure. And this is where things get really interesting because the 2024 US presidential election becomes a huge factor. Imagine if Donald Trump wins, who, by the way, shares a lot of the AFD's views on immigration, trade, globalism. Well, in that scenario, you could see Germany and the US actually getting closer.
So the AfD and a Trump administration, they might find common ground and work more closely together on the world stage.
Exactly. They could collaborate on things like, pushing back against China, tightening immigration policies, maybe even withdrawing from international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord. It'd be a big shift in the transatlantic relationship, away from the multilateral cooperative approach that we've seen for decades.
But wouldn't it be completely different if a Democrat wins in 2024? I can't imagine an AfD-led Germany and a Democratic administration getting along very well.
Yeah, you're right. That's where the potential for conflict comes in. A Democratic president, especially one focused on international cooperation and climate action, they'd probably clash with the AFD's agenda. Disagreements on trade, climate change, human rights, foreign policy, you name it. It could lead to a real cooling of relations between Germany and the U.S.
Almost like the whole U.S.-German relationship is hanging in the balance with these two totally different paths depending on who's in the White House. It's all so unpredictable. But what about Germany's relationships with other major players like Russia and China? Those are important too, right?
Absolutely. And both of those relationships could change a lot under an AFD government. Let's start with Russia. The AFD has historically been more friendly towards Russia than other German parties. They've criticized the sanctions imposed on Russia after they annexed Crimea, and they've even talked about closer economic ties.
That seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Wouldn't a right-wing nationalist party be suspicious of Russia's ambitions? What's driving this potential shift towards closer ties with Moscow?
It's complicated, a mix of factors. Some in the AFD see Russia as a natural ally against what they see as this liberal, globalist world order dominated by the US and the EU. They also see Russia as a key partner for energy security and for fighting Islamic extremism.
So it's more about shared enemies and strategic interests than ideology, then. Realpolitik, as they say. But wouldn't a softer stance on Russia cause problems within the EU and NATO? I mean, those sanctions were put in place for a reason, weren't they?
Yeah, definitely. If an AFD-led Germany pushed for easing sanctions or getting closer to Russia, it would face a lot of resistance from other EU and NATO members. They'd see it as undermining the West's united front against Russian aggression, and it could definitely lead to more tension within those alliances.
So we're talking about a potential realignment of Germany's foreign policy with warmer relations with Russia and a U.S. relationship that hinges on the 2024 election. But what about China? They're a huge economic partner for Germany, but also a growing rival.
Right.
How would an AfD government handle that complex relationship?
That's a tough one. The AFD is definitely wary of China's growing power, both economically and politically. They've been critical of China's trade practices, their human rights record. They've talked about taking a tougher stance towards Beijing, but they also know how important the Chinese market is for German exports. They wouldn't want to jeopardize that economic relationship.
So it's a balancing act between economic interests and strategic concerns. They want to stand up to China, but they also can't afford to alienate them. It's a dilemma a lot of countries are facing these days. But with all this talk of shifting alliances and changing priorities, what about Germany's military role in the world? How might that change under an AfD government?
Well, this is another area where the AFD's views are pretty different from the mainstream in Germany. They're skeptical of NATO, and they've called for Germany to spend less on defense, maybe even withdraw from the alliance altogether. They also tend to be more isolationist when it comes to military intervention abroad.
So less NATO, less military spending, less intervention abroad. It seems like they want a Germany that's more inward-looking, less involved globally. But wouldn't that create a vacuum in global leadership, especially if the U.S. is potentially pulling back as well? I mean, who would step in to fill that void?
That's the big question, and it's one that the analysis doesn't really answer. It just highlights all the uncertainty and potential instability that could come from all these political shifts happening at the same time. A more assertive Russia, a rising China, a possibly retreating U.S., and a Germany turning inward.
Okay, so we've gone from the streets of Berlin to the halls of Brussels, all the way to the global stage. It's a lot to process. But before we get completely lost in this geopolitical maze, I think it's important to bring it back to our listener. What does all this mean for them, for their own corner of the world?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's about connecting those global dots to your own local reality.
So for our listener out there, think about this. Do you live in a country that relies on trade with Germany? Do you have family or friends who might be affected by changes in immigration policies? Do you work in a field that's vulnerable to shifts in global trade or environmental regulations?
Those are all good questions to consider because even though we've been focusing on Germany, the potential consequences of these political shifts, they go way beyond national borders. It's a reminder that we're all connected, and what happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects on all of us.
It's easy to get caught up in our daily lives and forget about the bigger picture. But this deep dive has really shown how important it is to stay informed and engage with these global issues.
Absolutely. It's about being aware of what's happening in the world, thinking critically about all the information we're bombarded with, and having real conversations about the challenges and opportunities we're facing. Because in a world that's as interconnected as ours, understanding these potential ripple effects is the first step towards navigating the uncertainty and shaping a better future for everyone.
Well said. This has been a fascinating and honestly a bit unsettling look at this hypothetical but very possible scenario. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep exploring, and keep connecting those dots.